What happened in the next 90 seconds became the most talked about moment in Hollywood stunt history. The insurance companies launched investigations because of it. And for the first time in 30 years, Frank Castellano started connecting dots he'd been afraid to connect. The day Tommy collapsed during a routine scene. The day Frank realized someone had been killing people on his watch his entire career. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's knees hit the soundstage concrete 3 seconds after Chuck. Tommy's eyes were wide, unfocused, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth like a broken faucet. Frank had seen this exact look 16 times before across 17 different sets, and his stomach lurched with the familiar weight of recognition. "Get the medics!" Chuck's voice boomed across soundstage 7, but he wasn't looking at Tommy. His eyes were locked on Frank's face, reading something there that made Chuck's jaw tighten. "Now!" Frank's hands hovered over Tommy's chest, muscle memory from 3 decades of onset emergencies kicking in, but his mind was racing backward. The spinning back fist had been perfect. Tommy had executed it flawlessly. Frank had choreographed that exact sequence himself, had watched Tommy practice it 47 times over the past week. There was no way it could have gone wrong naturally. "Frank," Chuck's voice was quieter now, urgent. His pupils are dilated. "This isn't impact trauma." The observation hit Frank like a sledgehammer. Chuck was right, and Chuck knowing to look for that detail sent ice through Frank's veins. In 30 years of stunt coordination, Frank had become an expert at recognizing the signs, the glassy eyes, the way the blood pooled, the subtle tremor in the extremities. Tommy hadn't been hurt by the fall. Tommy had been poisoned. Around them, the crew erupted into controlled chaos. Assistant directors shouted orders, camera operators secured equipment, and the craft services team cleared pathways for the incoming medical team. But Frank's world had narrowed to a tunnel. Chuck Norris crouched beside him, and for the first time since 1994, Frank Castellano was genuinely afraid. "How long?" Chuck asked, his voice barely audible under the surrounding commotion. Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. "How long what? How long have you known?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Frank's hands were still on Tommy's chest, feeling the irregular heartbeat, the shallow breathing, but his eyes were locked on Chuck's face. There was no surprise there, no confusion. Just grim acknowledgement, like a man who'd been waiting for this moment for decades. The medics burst through the soundstage doors, their equipment cases clattering against the concrete floor. Frank forced himself to step back, to let them work, but his legs felt unsteady. Chuck remained crouched beside Tommy, one hand on the kid's shoulder, watching the EMTs with the focused intensity of someone who'd seen this dance before. "Possible poisoning," Chuck told the lead medic without hesitation. "Pupils dilated, blood from oral cavity, onset approximately 4 minutes ago." Frank's world tilted. Chuck wasn't guessing. He was reporting. As the medics worked, Frank's mind raced through the roster of everyone who'd had access to the soundstage today. 40 crew members, but how many had been close enough to Tommy in the hour before the scene? How many had access to his water bottle, his coffee, his... Frank. Chuck was standing now, his hand heavy on Frank's shoulder. "We need to talk. Privately." The words sounded like a death sentence. Frank watched Tommy being loaded onto a stretcher, watched his protégé's pale face disappear behind an oxygen mask, and felt the weight of 17 previous accidents pressing down on his chest like concrete blocks. "The kid's going to be okay," Chuck said, but his tone suggested he knew things Frank didn't. "Question is, are you?" Frank forced himself to meet Chuck's eyes. In them, he saw 30 years of unasked questions, of careful observation, of dots being connected in real time. Chuck Norris hadn't just happened to be the first one to reach Tommy. Chuck had been watching, waiting, expecting something to go wrong. "How long have you been watching me?" Frank asked. Chuck's smile was grim. "Wrong question, Frank. You should be asking how long I've been protecting you." The soundstage was clearing now, crew members filing out in whispered clusters, equipment being secured, the normal end-of-day procedures accelerated by crisis. But Frank couldn't move. The revelation that Chuck had been protecting him meant someone else had been hunting him. For how long? And if Chuck knew enough to watch for poisoning, what else did he know about the 17 accidents that had haunted Frank's dreams for 3 decades? "My daughter," Frank said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Sarah starts work on the Paramount lot next week. Script supervisor on the new Marvel thing." Chuck's expression darkened. "I know." 2 words that confirmed Frank's worst fear. This wasn't random. This wasn't about Tommy. Not really. Someone was sending a message, and that message was that no one Frank cared about was safe. Not his protege, not his daughter, and after 30 years of playing along with a game whose rules he'd never fully understood, maybe not Frank himself. The soundstage was nearly empty now, just Frank and Chuck standing in the space where Tommy had fallen, where everything had changed. If you're just joining us, you're about to discover how deep this conspiracy goes. Hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we dive into the original accident that started it all, and you won't believe who was really responsible for what happened to Bruce Lee. The weight of Chuck's knowledge settled over Frank like a burial shroud. Standing in the cavernous soundstage, surrounded by the skeletal remains of today's shoot, cables coiled like sleeping snakes, cameras draped in protective covers, the lingering scent of stage smoke and Tommy's fierce sweat, Frank felt the careful architecture of his protected life beginning to crumble. "Sarah doesn't know anything," Frank said, his voice hoarse. The words echoed off the concrete walls, bouncing back to him like an accusation. "She's just a kid trying to make it in the business. 26 years old, Chuck. She has nothing to do with any of this." Chuck's boots scraped against the concrete as he moved closer. "You think that matters to them? After what happened today?" His voice carried the weight of hard experience. Tommy was just your protege, and look where that got him. Frank's hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket. Sarah's last text was still there, sent 3 hours ago. "First day jitters. Wish me luck, Dad. Love you." He'd been meaning to respond when the camera started rolling. Now the simple message felt like a time bomb. "I need to call her," Frank muttered, but Chuck's hand closed over his wrist. "No, not from here. Not on that phone." Chuck's grip was firm but not unkind. "Frank, you've been playing defense for 30 years. It's time you understood the game." The soundstage lights dimmed to half power, casting long shadows between the equipment. In the amber glow, Frank could see the chalk outline where Tommy had fallen, a grotesque reminder that his careful distance from the past had just collapsed. He thought about Sarah at her apartment in Burbank, probably reviewing tomorrow's script pages. Maybe calling her mother to share her excitement about working on a real Marvel production. Normal life, the kind of life Frank had spent 3 decades ensuring she could have. "Tell me about Bruce Lee," Chuck said quietly. The name hit Frank like a physical blow. He hadn't spoken it aloud in 15 years, had trained himself to think around it, to remember that time in careful euphemisms and half-truths. But standing here with Tommy's blood still staining the concrete and his daughter's safety hanging in the balance, the old defenses felt suddenly fragile. "It was 1973, Frank began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was 28, just got my first real gig as an assistant stunt coordinator. Enter the Dragon was everything to me, working with Bruce, learning from the best, building a career." He paused, remembering the humid Hong Kong air, the sound of Bruce's practice sessions echoing through the studio before dawn. "There was an accident during the final fight scene. At least that's what everyone called it." Chuck waited, patient as stone. Around them, the soundstage settled into its nighttime quiet, the building's bones creaking as the California heat gave way to evening cool. "Bruce didn't die on that set," Frank continued, his throat tight, "but someone else did. A grip named Wei Lin, 23 years old, had a wife and a baby daughter." Frank closed his eyes and he was back there. The smell of cordite from the squib charges, the chaos of the fight scene, the moment when everything went wrong. The safety cable was cut. Wei Lin fell 30 feet into a concrete pit, broke his neck. "And?" Chuck's voice was gentle but insistent. "And Bruce saw who did it, saw who cut that cable." Frank opened his eyes, meeting Chuck's gaze. 3 weeks later, Bruce was dead. Cerebral edema, they said, brain swelling from an allergic reaction to painkillers. But I was there when he made the first call to the police about Wei Lin. I heard him talking to his lawyer about what he'd witnessed. The pieces fell into place between them like dominoes. Chuck nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd suspected for years. "You've been keeping quiet about what Bruce told you," Chuck said. "It wasn't a question." "For 30 years, Frank admitted. Every time I got close to talking, something happened. An accident on set, a near miss with a car, a break-in at my apartment where nothing was stolen but everything was searched." He thought about Sarah's laugh, the way she'd inherited her mother's stubborn optimism and Bruce Lee's fierce dedication to perfection. "I convinced myself I was protecting her by staying silent, building a life where she could be safe." Chuck's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "Hospital," he said, but didn't answer. "Frank, there's something you need to understand. Whoever did this, whoever's been hunting you all these years, they're not just trying to keep you quiet anymore. Today was a declaration. They're moving to endgame." Frank felt his world narrow to a pinpoint of clarity. Sarah's face, bright with excitement about her new job. Tommy's pale features disappearing behind an oxygen mask. 30 years of careful silence that had just been shattered by a poisoned protege and a knowing look from Chuck Norris. "What do you need me to do?" Frank asked. Chuck's smile was grim but determined. "Help me end this, before they get to Sarah." Frank started to respond when Chuck's phone rang again. This time, Chuck answered. "Norris." His voice was clipped, professional. Frank watched Chuck's face change as he listened, watched the color drain from his weathered features. "When? How long ago?" "No, don't touch anything. We're on our way." Chuck ended the call and stared at the phone for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. "What?" Frank's voice cracked on the single word. "That wasn't the hospital," Chuck said slowly. "That was my security guy. Someone broke into my house 20 minutes ago. They didn't take anything." His eyes met Frank's, but they left something behind. The drive to Chuck's Malibu compound passed in tense silence. Frank's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel of Chuck's pickup truck. Every shadow on the Pacific Coast Highway looked like a threat. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror a potential tale. Frank's mind kept circling back to Sarah, to the text he couldn't send, to the phone call he couldn't make. 30 years of careful distance from the truth, and now he was racing towards something that felt like a reckoning. Chuck's house sat on 3 acres of carefully manicured hillside, all earth tones and strategic lighting designed to blend into the California landscape. The security system had been disabled from the inside. Professionally, Chuck's man reported. No signs of forced entry or struggle. Whoever had been here knew what they were doing. In the study, the security guard said, a compact man named Torres who moved like former military. "You're going to want to see this." Frank followed Chuck through the house, past walls lined with movie posters and martial arts weapons, past photographs of Chuck with presidents and action stars and championship fighters. The study was a comfortable room with leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the kind of place where a man could think about legacy and mortality. On Chuck's desk sat a manila envelope, thick and yellowed with age. Frank's blood turned to ice water when he saw his own name written across it in familiar handwriting, block letters in blue ballpoint pen, the same handwriting he'd seen on call sheets and script notes 30 years ago, the same handwriting that had stopped appearing on film sets the day after Bruce Lee died. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered. "That's Bruce's writing." Chuck nodded grimly. "Open it." Frank's hands shook as he lifted the envelope. It was heavier than it looked, stuffed with what felt like photographs and documents. The flap wasn't sealed. Someone had opened it recently, probably whoever had broken in. Frank's name was written on a piece of masking tape stuck to the front, and underneath it, in smaller letters, "In case something happens to me." Inside were photographs, black and white, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. Wei Lin's accident, captured frame by frame like a grotesque stop-motion sequence. Frank had seen the official investigation photos, but these were different. These showed angles the police had never seen, moments they'd never documented. And in the corner of 3 different shots, barely visible but unmistakably there, was a figure in a studio jacket cutting the safety cable while the crew was distracted by the main action. Frank's legs gave out. He sank into one of Chuck's leather chairs, the photographs scattered across his lap like accusations. After all these years, after 3 decades of wondering and fearing and looking over his shoulder, here was proof of what Bruce had seen, evidence that could have solved a murder and maybe prevented another one. "There's more," Chuck said quietly. Frank looked up to see Chuck holding a letter, 2 pages of Bruce's distinctive handwriting on yellow legal paper. Chuck's face was ashen as he read. "What does it say?" "It's addressed to you. Bruce wrote it 3 days before he died." Chuck's voice was steady, but Frank could hear the tension underneath. "He says he was going to give this to you in person, but he was worried about being watched. He wanted you to know the truth in case something happened to him." Chuck handed him the letter. Frank's vision blurred as he tried to focus on Bruce's words, but one paragraph stood out with crystal clarity. "Frank, I know I can trust you with this because you were there when Wei Lin died, and you've never spoken about what we both know wasn't an accident. The man who killed Wei Lin is still working in the industry. He's powerful, connected, and he's already threatened me twice. If you're reading this, it means my fears were justified. The photos will show you who he is, but Frank, he's not working alone. There's someone above him, someone who's been using the industry to cover up mistakes for years. Wei Lin found out about the money, about the skimming from the Hong Kong co-production deals. That's why he had to die. And now they know I know." Frank's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the paper. 30 years. 30 years of running from a truth that had been waiting for him in Chuck Norris's study, hidden away like evidence in a time capsule. "Chuck," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "how long have you had this?" Chuck's expression was unreadable. "Since 1973, Frank Bruce gave it to me the night before he died." Frank stared at Chuck like he'd been slapped. The weight of 30 years collapsed into this single moment. Bruce's letter trembling in his hands, the photographs of Wei Lin's murder scattered around him like confetti from hell, and Chuck Norris sitting across from him with the calm expression of a man who'd been carrying nuclear secrets for 3 decades. "You've had this since 1973, Frank repeated, his voice hollow. "Bruce gave you evidence of murder, and you've been sitting on it for 30 years. Frank—" "No." Frank shot to his feet, the photograph sliding to the floor. "No, don't you dare. While I've been running, while I've been looking over my shoulder every goddamn day, while I've been terrified that someone would hurt my daughter, you've been sitting here in your Malibu mansion with the truth locked in your fucking desk drawer." Chuck's composure never cracked. "You think it was that simple? I think you could have ended this." Frank's voice echoed off the study walls. "I think Bruce Lee died believing he could trust you, and instead of going to the police, instead of getting justice for Wei Lin, you decided to play it safe." "Safe?" Chuck stood slowly, and for the first time Frank saw something dangerous in his eyes. "You want to know about safe, Frank? 3 days after Bruce died, my house burned down. 2 weeks later, my girlfriend at the time was run off the road. 6 months after that, my stunt double on Good Guys Wear Black had a freak accident with a motorcycle that put him in the hospital for 4 months. Frank's anger faltered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I tried, Frank. I went to the LAPD with Bruce's letter exactly once. Within 48 hours, Detective Raymond Kowalski, the man I handed the evidence to, was found dead in his apartment. Single gunshot made to look like suicide." Chuck moved to the window, gazing out at the dark Pacific. "That's when I realized how deep this goes. That's when I understood that whoever killed Wei Lin and Bruce wasn't just some rogue grip with a grudge. This was organized, protected." The room felt like it was spinning. Frank sank back into the chair, Bruce's letter crumpled in his fist. "So you just gave up?" "I got smart." Chuck turned back to Frank, and his expression was granite hard. "I started watching, learning, building my own network of people who could see what was happening. Do you think it's coincidence that you've survived 30 years, Frank? Do you think luck kept you breathing when 17 other people had accidents?" Frank's mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "I mean, every time they moved on you, I moved faster. The car that almost hit you outside the Terminator 2 set, I had someone disable the brakes 3 blocks away. The rigging failure that nearly killed you on face-off, I had my guys check every piece of equipment twice before you touched it. The break-in at your apartment in '98, you never knew there was a second break in the same night, did you? one where the intruders didn't make it out. Frank felt like he was drowning. "You've been protecting me?" "Bruce asked me to watch out for you in his letter. Said you were the only other witness he trusted." Chuck's voice softened slightly. "I've been keeping you alive, Frank, but I couldn't keep you completely safe without making you a target. So I let them think their intimidation was working. Let them believe you were too scared to talk. But Tommy was a message," Chuck interrupted. "They're done waiting. Whoever's been pulling the strings for 30 years has decided it's time to clean house permanently." He gestured toward the scattered photographs. "Someone knew I had Bruce's evidence. Someone knew exactly where to find it." Frank's blood turned to ice. "The break-in. They didn't leave this here. They took something else." Chuck nodded grimly. "The original negatives. These are just prints. Without the originals, without chain of custody, these photos are worthless as evidence. Then why leave them?" "Because they want us to know we're beaten. They want us to understand that after 30 years, they're ready to finish what they started." Chuck moved to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out A45 automatic. "The question is, are we going to let them?" Frank looked down at Bruce's letter, at the final paragraph he hadn't read yet. "If they come for me, Frank, promise me you'll find a way to get justice for Wei Lin. His daughter deserves to know her father didn't die because of careless rigging. She deserves to know he was murdered because he tried to do the right thing. Don't let his death be meaningless like mine will be." Frank's hands stopped shaking. "Chuck, what's the name of Wei Lin's daughter?" Chuck checked his watch. "Why? Just tell me." "Sarah. Sarah Lynn Martinez. She kept her father's name when she got married, then went back to Lynn after her divorce." Chuck paused. "Why does that matter?" Frank's world exploded into perfect, terrible clarity. "Because that's my daughter's name, Chuck. Sarah Lynn. She's not just starting work at Paramount." His voice was barely a whisper. "She's been hunting the same people we have." The silence stretched between them like a live wire. Chuck's face went through a series of calculations. Disbelief, recognition, and finally a kind of grim acceptance that made Frank's chest tighten with dread. "How long have you known?" Chuck asked quietly. "I didn't know. Not until this second." Frank's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "I thought I was protecting her by keeping her away from all this. Turns out I was protecting her from learning about her own father." Chuck moved to a filing cabinet, his movements deliberate and careful. "Frank, when did you adopt Sarah?" 1975. She was 3 years old. Her mother." Frank stopped, memory crystallizing into horrible understanding. "Her mother was Wei Lin's widow, Li Mei. She was working as a seamstress in Chinatown, barely making rent. Sarah was malnourished, sick all the time. Li Mei begged me to take her, said she couldn't protect her daughter from the people who'd killed her husband." "And you never told Sarah the truth about her father?" "Li Mei made me promise, said if Sarah ever went looking for answers about Wei Lin's death, they'd kill her too." Frank's hands were shaking again, but this time with rage rather than fear. "Jesus Christ, Chuck, she's not working at Paramount by accident, is she?" Chuck pulled out a thick file folder, dropped it on the desk between them. The tab read S. Lynn, employment background. Inside were photocopies of employment records, background checks, and what looked like surveillance photos going back 5 years. "Your daughter has been working her way through the industry systematically," Chuck said. "Started as a PA on independent films, always gravitating toward projects that involved people who worked in Hong Kong in the 70s. She spent 8 months as an assistant to the line producer on The Replacement Killers, a guy named Marcus Vega, who was a location manager on Enter the Dragon." Frank flipped through the papers, each page making his stomach clench tighter. There was Sarah at craft services tables, Sarah taking notes during production meetings, Sarah asking questions of grips and gaffers and stunt coordinators who'd been around long enough to remember the old days. She wasn't just working in Hollywood. She was conducting an investigation. She's been building a network, Frank realized. Getting close to people who might know something. More than that. Chuck pointed to a surveillance photo dated 3 weeks ago. Sarah was sitting across from an elderly Chinese man in what looked like a restaurant booth, a notebook open between them. "That's Henry Tong. He was the head of the Hong Kong stunt team on Enter the Dragon. Officially, he died in a car accident in 1989. Unofficially, I've been keeping him alive in a nursing home in San Francisco under an assumed name." Frank stared at the photo. His daughter's face was intent, focused, wearing the same expression she'd had as a little girl when she was solving puzzles or figuring out how things worked. What did Henry tell her? Everything. About the money laundering through the CO production deals, about Wei Lin discovering that someone was skimming funds and using shell companies to hide the trail, about the night Wei Lin was supposed to meet with Bruce and ended up dead instead. Chuck's voice was flat, clinical. Henry also told her about the man who cut the safety cable, someone she's been trying to identify for months, and now she thinks she's found him. No, Frank. Chuck pulled out one more document, a call log from Sarah's cell phone, dated yesterday. She knows she's found him. She called the number 40 7 times in the past week, the same number that's been calling me since Tommy collapsed. Frank looked at the number, and his blood turned to ice water. He recognized it from the business cards scattered around his apartment, from the production schedules he'd been getting for years. It was a number he'd called himself just last week to confirm his schedule for final strike. "That's Marcus Fielding," Frank whispered. "The line producer on this film. He's been running production since the 70s, always seems to be around when there are accidents." Marcus Fielding, whose real name is Marcus Vega, Chuck confirmed. The same Marcus Vega who was on set the day Wei Lin died, who's been systematically eliminating witnesses for 30 years, and who hired both you and your daughter for the same production. The room spun around Frank like a centrifuge. Sarah's excitement about her new job took on a sinister dimension, not the enthusiasm of a young woman starting her career, but the anticipation of someone finally getting close enough to her father's killer to do something about it. "Chuck, where is she right now?" Chuck checked his watch again. "According to the production schedule, she's supposed to be at the studio tonight. There's a late shoot scheduled to finish the fight sequence we started today." His expression was grim. The same sequence where Tommy collapsed. Frank was already moving toward the door when Chuck's voice stopped him cold. "Frank." Sarah didn't just figure out who killed her father. She figured out how to kill him back. Frank's hand froze on the doorknob. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He turned back to Chuck, searching his face for some sign that he'd misunderstood. "What did you just say?" Chuck's expression was stone. "Tommy's collapse wasn't an accident, Frank, and it wasn't Marcus trying to send a message." He pulled out one more photograph from the file, a close-up shot of Tommy's water bottle, taken with a telephoto lens. Sarah was the last person to touch Tommy's water before he drank it. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Frank's feet. No, that's impossible. Sarah wouldn't, she's not a killer." "Isn't she?" Chuck's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Frank, what do you know about Sarah's life since she moved to Los Angeles? Her real life, not the version she shows you during your monthly dinners?" Frank's mouth opened, but no words came. The truth was, he knew almost nothing. Sarah had always been private, independent. He'd assumed it was because of the way he'd raised her, teaching her to be self-sufficient, to trust no one completely. Now that self-sufficiency felt ominous. "She's been using the name Sarah Martinez on some of her jobs," Chuck continued. "Creating multiple identities, building false histories. 3 months ago, she rented a storage unit under that name. Want to guess what's in it?" Frank's legs gave out. He slumped against the door, his mind reeling through 30 years of memories that suddenly looked different. Sarah's questions about his work that he'd thought were innocent curiosity, her knowledge of film production that seemed too sophisticated for someone just starting out, the way she'd pushed him to take the job on final strike, insisting it would be good for his career. "She's been planning this," he whispered. "For years, maybe her whole adult life." Chuck moved closer, his voice urgent now. "Frank, listen to me. Sarah didn't just want to find her father's killer, she wanted to make him pay. And she's been using you to get close enough to do it. But Tommy's innocent. He's just a kid. Tommy's not dead, Frank. He's in the hospital, and he's going to be fine. Sarah gave him something that would make him sick, not kill him. She needed everyone focused, on the medical emergency so she could access Marcus's office. Chuck grabbed Frank by the shoulders. While you were panicking about Tommy, while I was dealing with paramedics, Sarah was planting evidence in Marcus's computer. Financial records, email chains, connections to all the other accidents over the years. She's been building a case. Frank tried to process what he was hearing, but it felt like trying to hold water in his hands. Evidence? What kind of evidence? The kind that will send Marcus to prison for the rest of his life, or get him killed by the people above him who don't want to be exposed. Chuck's grip tightened. Your daughter isn't just hunting her father's killer, Frank. She's been systematically destroying the entire network, every mysterious accident, every convenient death. She's been documenting all of it, building an airtight case that will bring down everyone involved. Frank thought about Sarah's apartment, sparse and organized like a safe house. Her laptop that she never left unattended. The way she always seemed to know more about his work than she should have. How long have you known? I suspected for months. Confirmed it 2 weeks ago when my security caught her trying to break into this house. Chuck released Frank's shoulders, stepped back. She wasn't trying to steal Bruce's evidence, Frank. She was trying to return something. Chuck walked to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. When he unwrapped it, Frank's heart stopped. It was a jade pendant carved in the shape of a dragon, the same pendant Wei Lin had worn every day on set, the one Frank remembered seeing around his neck the morning he died. Sarah's been carrying this since she was 3 years old, Chuck said. Li Mei gave it to her before she died, told her it was all she had left of her father. But Frank, this pendant contains a microcassette recorder. Wei Lin was documenting everything. Sarah's had evidence of her father's murder her entire life. Frank stared at the pendant, understanding dawning like a nightmare. She's known the truth all along. Not the details, not the names. But she's known her father was murdered, and she's known that the people responsible were still out there. Chuck rewrapped the pendant carefully. She spent 30 years preparing for this moment. And you, Frank, you were never her adopted father protecting her from the truth. You were her inside source, her way into the industry that killed her father. The revelation hit Frank like a sledgehammer. Every conversation, every shared meal, every expression of love and concern from the daughter he'd raised, it all recontextualized in an instant. Sarah hadn't been living her life, she'd been executing a plan. She played me, Frank whispered. She played all of us. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Frank felt something fundamental crack inside his chest, not his heart breaking, but something deeper. The foundation of who he thought he was, who he thought she was, crumbling into dust. 30 years, he said, his voice barely audible. 30 years of thinking I was her father. Chuck's expression softened slightly. Frank, that doesn't mean... Yes, it does. Frank pushed himself away from the door, pacing to the window where the Pacific stretched endlessly into darkness. It means everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. It means the only good thing I ever did, raising that little girl, protecting her, loving her, was just me being a useful idiot. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, remembering Sarah at 5 years old, crying from nightmares she could never explain. At 8, asking careful questions about what kind of work made people fall down and not get up. At 15, writing a school essay about justice that had made him so proud he'd kept a copy in his wallet for years. She'd been planning his father's revenge since she was a child. The storage unit, Frank said without turning around. What else is in it besides evidence? Chuck was quiet for so long that Frank finally looked back. The older man was holding Bruce Lee's letter again, reading it with the careful attention of someone looking for answers in familiar text. Photographs, Chuck said finally. Pictures of every person who's died suspiciously in the industry over the past 3 decades. She's got files on all of them. Accident reports, witness statements, financial records showing payments that don't add up. He paused. She's also got surveillance photos of you, Frank. Hundreds of them, going back years. She's been watching you as much as you thought you were watching out for her. Frank's reflection stared back at him from the window. A 58-year-old man who looked every day of his age, lines carved deep by 3 decades of carrying guilt and fear. She never loved me. Not once. I don't think that's true. Don't. Frank's voice was sharp enough to cut. Don't try to make this easier. She used me. She's been using me since she was old enough to understand what I was useful for. He turned back to Chuck, and something cold had settled behind his eyes. The question is, what happens now? Chuck glanced at his watch again, a gesture that was becoming increasingly ominous. Now Sarah's at the studio with Marcus, probably ready to spring whatever trap she's spent years setting up. And we have to decide if we're going to stop her or help her. Stop her. Why would we stop her? Because Marcus isn't the end of this chain, Frank. He's middle management. The real power, the people who've been protecting this operation for 30 years, they're still out there. And if Sarah moves too fast, if she exposes Marcus without taking down the whole network, Chuck shook his head, they'll kill her and disappear forever. 30 years of planning dies with her. Frank felt a bitter laugh bubbling up from somewhere dark. You're asking me to save the daughter who's been manipulating me for my entire adult life so she can successfully murder the man who killed her real father. I'm asking you to decide what justice looks like. Chuck moved to his desk, picked up the loaded pistol he'd placed there earlier. Because Sarah's going to force that decision tonight, whether we're ready or not. Frank looked around the study, at Bruce Lee's scattered photographs, at the evidence of 30 years of carefully orchestrated deaths, at the man who'd been playing guardian angel while Frank thought he was fighting alone. Nothing in his life was what he'd believed it to be. There's something you're not telling me, Frank said. Something about tonight specifically. Sarah could have made her move months ago, but she waited until now, until this production. Why? Chuck's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Because Marcus isn't just going to be at the studio tonight for the reshoot. He's meeting with his contact from Hong Kong, the man who's been coordinating the cover-up from the beginning. Chuck's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Sarah doesn't just want Marcus, Frank. She wants all of them. Who? Who's the contact? Someone who was supposed to be dead 20 years ago. Chuck ejected the magazine from his pistol, checked it, slammed it home again. Someone whose death I've been faking almost as long as I've been keeping you alive. Frank felt the last piece of solid ground disappear beneath his feet. Chuck, who are we talking about? Chuck looked up from his weapon, and Frank saw something that might have been respect in his eyes. Your daughter figured out that Henry Tong didn't die in that car accident. She tracked him down, got him talking, and learned something I've been keeping secret for decades. He holstered the gun. Henry wasn't just a witness to Wei Lin's murder, Frank. Henry was the one who recruited Wei Lin to expose the money laundering in the first place. Jesus Christ. Henry's been playing dead while feeding information to people like Sarah, helping them build cases against the network that tried to kill him. Tonight, he's coming out of hiding. Chuck moved toward the door. Sarah's not just planning to expose her father's killer. She's planning to reunite the only 2 people who can testify about what really happened on the set of Enter the Dragon. Frank understood with perfect, terrible clarity. She needs us there. No, Frank. Chuck opened the door, stepped into the hallway. She needs you to choose whose side you're on. Because after tonight, there won't be any more secrets left to hide behind. Frank followed Chuck through the darkened hallway, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the silence. The drive to the studio passed in a blur of streetlights and unspoken tension, each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation 30 years in the making. The Paramount lot at midnight felt like a graveyard of dreams. Security waved them through. Chuck's name still opened doors, even at this hour. They parked outside Stage 7, where the lights were still burning for the scheduled reshoot that Frank now understood was something else entirely. She'll have positioned everything perfectly, Chuck said as they approached the entrance. Sarah's had years to plan this moment. Every variable accounted for, every escape route mapped. Frank's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. Except for us showing up. No, Frank. She's counting on us showing up. The question is whether we're here to stop her or witness her revenge. Inside, the soundstage was lit like an operating theater. The fight sequence set, a recreation of the Hong Kong apartment from Enter the Dragon, stood in the center of the space, surrounded by cameras and lighting equipment. But something was wrong with the geography. The equipment had been repositioned, creating clear sight lines from multiple angles. Not for filming, Frank realized, for surveillance. Sarah stood near the craft services table, checking her watch with the casual precision of someone following a carefully rehearsed schedule. She wore dark clothing that would disappear into shadows, and her expression held the focused calm Frank had seen in the eyes of stunt performers seconds before they executed dangerous sequences. Marcus Fielding paced near the director's chairs, speaking rapidly into his phone. Even from a distance, Frank could see the sweat staining his shirt, the nervous energy of a man who sensed the trap closing but couldn't yet see its shape. "She drugged Tommy to get us all here," Frank said, the pieces finally clicking into place. The medical emergency was theater. She needed Marcus isolated, needed to control who else would be on set tonight. Chuck nodded grimly. And she needed witnesses, people who could corroborate what's about to happen. A door opened on the far side of the stage, and two figures emerged from the shadows. Frank's breath caught as he recognized the elderly Chinese man from the surveillance photos, Henry Tong, supposedly dead for 20 years, moving with the careful dignity of someone carrying decades of secrets. Behind him walked another figure that made Frank's blood freeze. Li Mei stepped into the light. Alive. Unmistakably alive, though marked by 30 years of hiding. Her face had hardened into something sculptural, beautiful but implacable. She moved with Sarah's same purposeful grace, and Frank understood with sickening clarity where his daughter had learned to disappear into plain sight. "My God," Frank whispered. "You've both been alive all this time." Sarah looked up at the sound of his voice, and her expression shifted slightly. Surprise, perhaps, but not shock. She'd expected him to figure it out, had probably counted on it. She raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. Marcus ended his phone call and noticed the new arrivals. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, recognition, terror, as he processed what he was seeing. Two people whose deaths he'd presumably helped arrange, standing in the same room where he'd planned to conduct business as usual. "This isn't possible," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the soundstage. "You're both dead. I was at Li Mei's funeral. I saw the accident reports." Li Mei spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the same musical quality Frank remembered from 30 years ago, but with an edge like broken glass. "You saw what Chuck arranged for you to see, what I needed you to see while I raised my daughter and taught her everything she would need to know about justice." The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. Not just that Li Mei was alive, but that Sarah's entire childhood, the childhood he'd thought he was providing, had been shared. Two parents, two influences, two different kinds of training. He'd taught her about guilt and fear and the weight of keeping secrets. Li Mei had taught her about patience and planning and revenge. Henry Tong pulled out a small digital recorder, held it up so everyone could see. "I've been waiting 30 years to tell this story properly," he said. "To people who could do something about it." Marcus backed toward the exit, but Chuck stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. The circle was complete. Predator surrounded by the ghosts of his victims, with no escape route left untouched. Sarah walked to the center of the stage, standing in the exact spot where her father had died. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent her entire life preparing for this moment. "My name is Sarah Lynn," she said, "and I've gathered you all here tonight to close a case that's been open for 30 years. The words echoed through the soundstage with the finality of a judge's gavel. Frank watched his daughter, not his daughter, he corrected himself, though the distinction felt meaningless now, command the space with an authority that made her seem older than her 30 years. "The night of March 15, 1993, Sarah continued. "My father, Wei Lin, was murdered on a film set very much like this one. The official cause of death was listed as equipment failure during a stunt sequence. But Wei Lin wasn't performing a stunt. He was meeting with someone he trusted to hand over evidence of money laundering, drug trafficking, and murder within the Hong Kong film industry." Marcus had stopped backing away. There was nowhere left to run, and something in his posture suggested he finally understood that running had never been an option tonight. Henry Tong stepped forward, the digital recorder still visible in his weathered hands. Wei Lin came to me 6 months before his death. He'd discovered that films were being used to move money between triads and American distributors. Not just money, information, weapons, people. An entire pipeline hidden inside the entertainment industry. Li Mei's voice cut through the air like silk over steel. He thought he was protecting our family by gathering evidence. He thought justice would keep us safe. Her eyes fixed on Marcus with laser intensity. He didn't understand that some people consider justice itself to be a threat. Frank found himself remembering that night 3 decades ago with perfect clarity now. Not as he'd constructed it in his memory, but as it had actually happened. The way Marcus had appeared at his elbow just as the stunt went wrong. The calm certainty in his voice when he'd said the words that had shaped Frank's entire adult life. Keep your mouth shut, and everyone stays safe. You made me complicit, Frank said, his voice carrying further than he'd intended. For 30 years, you made me an accomplice to murder. Marcus finally spoke, and his voice held the flat resignation of a man watching his empire crumble. You were never supposed to be there that night, Castellano. You were supposed to be working on the 2nd unit. But I switched shifts to cover for Jimmy Kowalski. His daughter had pneumonia. The memory was crystal clear now, freed from 3 decades of guilt and deliberate forgetting. You had to improvise. We had to protect a multi-billion-dollar operation. Wei Lin would have destroyed everything. Legitimate businesses, thousands of jobs, entire families. Marcus straightened slightly, as if remembering he'd once been the kind of man who commanded respect. His death prevented a war. Sarah moved closer to the center of their circle, and Frank noticed she was recording everything on her phone. Prevented a war, she repeated. Is that what you called the 17 other murders over the next 3 decades? The number hit Frank like a physical blow. 17. The same number of accidents he'd been carrying on his conscience, thinking he'd failed to prevent them when he'd actually been herded toward them like cattle. Every death carefully orchestrated, every investigation subtly redirected. 17 people who got too close to the truth, Li Mei said. 17 families destroyed to protect your secret. Henry Tong pressed a button on his recorder. I have recordings of planning sessions going back 25 years. Names, dates, financial transfers. Everything Wei Lin started documenting, I continued. Chuck stepped out of the shadows completely now, and Frank saw him clearly for the first time tonight. Not as the action star he'd once been, but as a man who'd spent decades walking a tightrope between justice and survival. I helped fake their deaths, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Li Mei and Henry, I made them disappear before Marcus could finish what he started. And you never told me. Frank felt the last of his old life dissolving. All these years I thought I was protecting Sarah from a truth that would destroy her. She already knew everything. Sarah looked at him then, and for a moment her carefully constructed mask slipped. Underneath the cold purpose, Frank glimpsed something that might have been genuine regret. I needed you to be innocent, she said quietly. I needed someone who wasn't pretending, who didn't know they were playing a part. Your guilt was real. Your love was real. She paused. That made everything else believable. Marcus laughed bitterly. 30 years of planning for this moment, and what do you think you've accomplished? You think exposing me changes anything? I'm one small piece of something that stretches across 3 continents. You're right, Sarah said, which is why I'm not just exposing you. She pulled out a second phone, showed them the screen. It displayed a countdown timer with less than 2 minutes remaining. In 90 seconds, everything we've recorded tonight gets uploaded to 47 news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and government watchdog groups simultaneously, along with Henry's complete archive, financial records going back 30 years, and documented proof of every murder you've orchestrated. Sarah's voice held the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a perfectly executed plan reach its conclusion. You're not dying tonight, Marcus. You're living long enough to watch everything you've built burn down around you. The timer continued counting down, and Frank understood that he was witnessing something rarer than justice. He was watching the precise moment when 30 years of patient revenge finally came home.